Empty everything. Now. The TSA officer's command wasn't a request. He dumped the contents of a black woman's suitcase onto the metal table, his colleagues smirking at her humiliation. They had no idea the woman standing with silent, composed dignity was a United States ambassador, and they were moments from triggering a federal firestorm. But this wasn't just one bad day. The Transportation Security Administration faces thousands of formal complaints alleging racial profiling, with half indicating real discrimination. Black women are routinely singled out for invasive hair searches. The agency's officers operate with near-total legal immunity. So when does a humiliating stop become a federal case? And what happens when the person targeted has the power to fight back? This ambassador was about to expose a broken system hiding in plain sight. Her name was Ambassador Patricia Greer. A career diplomat for over 25 years, she was returning from closed-door negotiations in Brussels. She traveled light, one carry-on, her diplomatic passport clearly visible in the tray. But at the checkpoint in Terminal B, none of that seemed to matter. The first officer, a man in his 30s, glanced from her passport photo to her face, his expression unchanging. He swabbed her bag for explosives. The test was negative. Standard procedure should have ended there. It did not. He called over his supervisor. They pointed to the dense, elegant twist of silver-streaked hair piled atop her head. The new full-body scanners, deployed nationwide, are notoriously prone to false alarms on certain hair textures and styles popular among black women. The TSA's own data shows complaints about discriminatory hair pat-downs jumped from 73 to 105 in a single year. The supervisor, a woman with a stern ponytail, nodded. They would need to conduct a physical search. What followed was a masterclass in casual dehumanization. They didn't ask. They instructed. Empty your bag, place every item on the table. Ambassador Greer complied, her movements precise. She laid out her folded blouses, her toiletries, her confidential diplomatic cables in a sealed folder marked clearly with the State Department seal. The male officer picked up the folder. "Can you open this?" "These are sealed diplomatic materials," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I cannot." He smirked, exchanged a look with his partner, and dropped the folder back onto the growing pile of her private belongings. Then came the hair search. The female officer, donning fresh blue gloves, approached. The ambassador stood motionless as the agent's hands began probing her hairstyle, fingers pushing roughly through the intricate twist, violating a space of profound personal and cultural significance. Other passengers looked away, uncomfortable. The agents talked over her head, joking about a reality TV show. This was the heart of the problem: unchecked discretion. The TSA's controversial screening of passengers by Observation Techniques program, called SPOT, was officially defunded by Congress after a government study found it scientifically unsound. But its legacy remained: a system that encouraged officers to rely on subjective judgments, on hunches, on bias disguised as intuition. For Ambassador Greer, every second was a calculated exercise in restraint. Her training screamed to declare her status, to demand to speak to a federal security director. But another part of her, the woman who'd grown up facing these microaggressions 1,000 times before, wanted to see how far it would go. She was gathering evidence, not just for herself, but for the thousands who complained and were ignored. The Government Accountability Office reviewed over 2,000 civil rights complaints against the TSA. In roughly 52% of cases, they found indications of potential discrimination or unprofessional conduct. The system was designed to absorb these complaints, not to act on them. The male officer wasn't finished. He appended her suitcase, letting the remaining contents, underwear, socks, a small jewelry pouch, spill across the cold metal table. A quiet laugh escaped him. "Looks like you packed in a hurry." The humiliation was now a public spectacle. He held up a small, elegant perfume bottle from her toiletry kit. "This is over 3.4 ounces. "It's not," she stated. "It's a 2-ounce bottle. Check the label." He waved her off, dropping it into a bin for confiscated items. The decision was arbitrary, final. This was the ultimate power imbalance. In 2017, the Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals made a landmark ruling. TSA screeners, they determined, are not law enforcement officers. They are administrative employees. This legal distinction grants them a shield of immunity. Passengers cannot sue them for misconduct, no matter how egregious. The ambassador's diplomatic security detail. Two agents who had been discreetly observing from just beyond the checkpoint perimeter now had enough. They had video. They had witnessed multiple violations of protocol. As the male officer began reprimanding Ambassador Greer for her supposed attitude, the two men in dark suits moved. They were not running, but their approach was swift and direct, cutting through the crowd with an authority that made people instinctively step aside. The TSA officers, engrossed in their power play, didn't notice until the agents were upon them. "Sir, step back." The voice of the lead security agent was low, ice cold, and carried the unmistakable weight of federal authority. The TSA officer turned, his smirk freezing into confusion. "Who are you? Identify yourself." The security agent didn't answer him. He looked past the officer to the woman surrounded by her scattered life. "Madam Ambassador," he said, "are you all right?" The word ambassador cut through the terminal noise like a blade. The male TSA officer's smirk vanished, replaced by a blank processing stare. His colleague's arms slowly uncrossed. The joking tone they'd used moments before evaporated into the sterile, recycled air. "Madam Ambassador." The lead diplomatic security agent, Mark, kept his eyes locked on the officers as he presented his credentials to the suddenly pale supervisor. "United States Diplomatic Security Service. We need to speak with the Federal Security Director, now." The atmosphere transformed from one of casual power to one of cold, professional crisis. Other passengers, their phones subtly raised, captured the entire shift. The supervisor stammered, reaching for her radio. Ambassador Greer finally moved, carefully beginning to gather her scattered belongings from the table. She did not look at the officers. Her focus was on the methodical restoration of order. One of her security detail stepped in to help, but she waved him off with a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. This act of reclamation was hers. Within minutes, a man in a shirt and tie with a TSA management badge was rushing toward the checkpoint, his face tight with concern. The federal security director for the airport was on his way, but the chain of command was already buckling under its own weight. The supervisor tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other. She claimed the scanner alarm, the procedure, the bottle. Mark, the DSS agent, listened silently, then played a 30-second clip from his phone. The audio was crisp. The laughing, the comment about packing in a hurry, the demand to open sealed diplomatic pouches. The manager's face went from concern to grim resignation. Ambassador Greer, her suitcase repacked and closed, finally addressed the original officer directly. Her voice was calm, devoid of the anger he probably expected, which made it all the more terrifying. "What is your name and badge number?" He mumbled it. She didn't write it down. She simply nodded, committing it to memory. Then she turned to the manager. "I will be filing a formal incident report under the provisions of the Diplomatic Relations Act and the TSA's own civil rights complaint process. I expect a copy of all checkpoint video from the last 20 minutes to be preserved. Any failure to do so will be considered obstruction." She wasn't just complaining. She was laying the groundwork for a federal investigation, and she knew the law better than they did. The TSA's own internal guidelines, as revealed by a Government Accountability Office audit, require that all civil rights complaints be logged, investigated, and tracked. But the GAO found the agency's oversight was fragmented, inconsistent. Complaints got lost, were dismissed without real scrutiny. Ambassador Greer was bypassing the broken machine. She was creating a paper trail that would be impossible to ignore. The scene at the checkpoint dissolved as she was escorted, not to her gate, but to a private office in the secure side of the terminal. The drama was over for the gawking crowd, but for the ambassador, it was entering a new, more bureaucratic phase. In that sterile office, with airport executives and higher-level TSA officials now present, She detailed every minute of the encounter. She cited policy numbers. She referenced the TSA's mandated training on implicit bias, training that the GAO criticized as ineffective and poorly monitored. She was no longer a passenger. She was a prosecutor building her case. And then she pivoted. "This is not about me," she stated. "It is about a pattern. Between October 2015 and February 2018, your agency received approximately 3,700 complaints alleging civil rights violations. For about half of those, your own multicultural branch found indications of potential discrimination. What is being done about that half?" The room was silent. The officials glanced at each other. The standard public relations script, about safety being the priority, about procedures being followed, was useless here. They were facing a plaintiff who had memorized their own dirty laundry. Meanwhile, in the break room, the two officers were in freefall. The male officer, Officer Jenkins, was defiant at first. "I was doing my job." The scanner beeped. But the supervisor, her own job now on the line, shut him down. The scanner log for that lane showed no alarm for hair or headwear. The only alert was a routine negative explosive swab. He had invented the pretext. The female officer, Officer Briggs, was quieter, realizing the video showed her laughing, showed her hands aggressively searching the ambassador's hair after the ambassador had clearly expressed her discomfort. They were both placed on immediate administrative leave. But that was just the start of their troubles. The viral video, uploaded by a passenger, was already hitting thousands of views. The caption was brutal. "TSA humiliates black woman. Turns out she's a U.S. ambassador." Back in Washington, the incident landed like a grenade in the halls of the State Department. Diplomatic security launched an immediate inquiry. A formal protest was being drafted. But the real earthquake was within the Department of Homeland Security, the TSA's parent agency. A single complaint from a traveler could be buried. A formal, detailed, and legally flawless complaint from a sitting ambassador was a five-alarm fire. It triggered mandatory review processes that spiderwebbed through the Office of Civil Rights and Liberties, the Inspector General's office, and congressional oversight committees. Ambassador Greer, once airborne, did not rest. She opened her laptop and began drafting. She wasn't just writing a complaint. She was writing a manifesto. She connected her experience to the data. She referenced the 105 formal complaints about hair pat-downs in 2018 alone. She cited the leaked behavior detection officer materials that included indicators like face pale from recent shaving of beard, a clear targeting of Muslim men. Her testimony would become a skeleton key, unlocking scrutiny on thousands of buried cases. But the TSA's defense mechanism was already activating. The first leaked internal email from a mid-level manager framed the coming narrative. Subject: potential media storm ray, Terminal B incident. Talking points included: officer possibly overzealous in pursuit of safety. Ambassador could have identified herself sooner. Diplomatic materials may have caused confusion. It was a classic playbook. Muddy the waters, shift blame, imply the victim was partly responsible. They were preparing to say the officers made a simple mistake, not that the system enabled bias. This is where the story pivoted from an incident to an institutional war. A whistleblower inside the TSA's Office of Civil Rights and Liberties, horrified by the email's tone, reached out to a contact at the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU had been fighting the TSA for years over profiling. They had stacks of Freedom of Information Act documents proving the agency knew its behavior detection program was junk science. The whistleblower sent a single line: "They're going to bury it. They have a file on her." The ACLU connected the dots to a previous, nearly forgotten case. In 2010, Indian Ambassador Meera Shankar was subjected to an invasive pat-down at an airport in Mississippi, despite her diplomatic status. The TSA's public response then: the screening was conducted according to procedure. No apology, no disciplinary action. The pattern was clear. The system absorbed diplomatic protests the same way it absorbed civilian ones, with bureaucratic inertia and denial. Ambassador Greer's plane touched down. Her security detail informed her the story was now national news. Requests for comment flooded her office. She authorized a single brief statement. I am pursuing all appropriate channels to address what occurred. My primary concern is ensuring no other traveler is subjected to discriminatory treatment under the guise of security. It was a diplomatic missile, precise and devastating. It made the story not about her, but about everyone. The TSA, feeling the pressure, made its first public move. A spokesperson announced the officers were on leave and that a full, fair investigation was underway. They reiterated their commitment to respectful treatment. It was the same script they'd used 100 times before, but this time the audience wasn't buying it. Members of Congress, particularly the Congressional Black Caucus, began issuing demands for hearings. The phrase legal immunity started trending. People were learning that thanks to that 2017 court ruling, TSA agents essentially cannot be sued. Public outrage met a legal dead end, and the contradiction fueled even more anger. Ambassador Greer's team made a strategic decision. They would not wait for the TSA's internal investigation, which could take months and end in a whitewash. They would file a formal complaint with the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General, an independent watchdog, and they would share their entire evidence packet, the video, the audio, the policy violations, with the House Committee on Homeland Security. They were going over the TSA's head, directly to its overseers. In a closed-door meeting with her chief of staff and legal counsel, the ambassador reviewed the video from the checkpoint one more time. Pausing it on a single frame, Officer Jenkins's face, mid-smirk, holding her perfume bottle. He wasn't just following protocol, he was enjoying it. That, her lawyer said, is the heart of it. It's not the search. It's the theater of humiliation. It's the assumption of power. And we can prove he knew he was wrong the second he heard the word ambassador. The media storm intensified. News segments featured interviews with other black women detailing their own horror stories at security. Wigs removed, braids painfully tugged, children crying as their mothers were publicly searched. The statistics became human. The TSA's facade of impartial procedure began to crack under the weight of collective testimony. Then the whistleblower delivered again. This time it wasn't an email, it was a file. A spreadsheet, anonymized but damning, showing the disposition of civil rights complaints from the ambassador's home state over the past 3 years. Of 200 logged complaints, only 10 had resulted in any disciplinary action. 30 were marked resolved, training recommended. The rest were simply closed, insufficient evidence. The system wasn't just flawed, it was designed to fail the complainant. Armed with this, Ambassador Greer's legal team made their final pre-hearing move. They subpoenaed the 2 TSA officers for depositions. They would have to testify under oath, not to their managers but to federal investigators. The game had changed entirely. The administrative leave was no longer a paid vacation. It was the quiet before a legal storm. Officer Jenkins hired a lawyer. Officer Briggs, according to colleagues, was not sleeping. The stage was set for a confrontation that would move from airport terminals to the halls of power. The ambassador had the evidence, the platform, and the moral authority. The TSA had a rulebook, a legal shield, and a deeply ingrained institutional instinct to protect itself. But as the date for the Inspector General's interview approached, a single, explosive question remained unanswered, a question posed by the whistleblower's note. What was in the file they had on her? The file was not a personnel record. It was a blueprint for deflection. The whistleblower's cache, delivered to the ACLU, contained internal memoranda and training presentations marked for management eyes only. One document, dated just 6 months before the airport incident, laid out the strategy for handling high-profile complaints. Step 1. Isolate the incident. Do not acknowledge patterns. Step 2. Emphasize officer discretion as a security necessity. Step 3. If pressed, offer refresher training as a solution, never disciplinary action. It was a playbook for impunity. And Ambassador Greer's case had been flagged as high-profile the moment her title was discovered. The file revealed something more sinister, a conscious effort to obscure data. Spreadsheets obtained by the ACLU showed how complaint codes were changed. An entry from a traveler alleging a racially motivated hair search would be recategorized as standard secondary screening before being entered into the official database. This statistical sleight of hand made the agency's own public reports, which claimed minimal racial disparity, utterly meaningless. The GAO had suspected this. Now they had proof. The system wasn't just failing to address bias, it was actively hiding it. Armed with this, the congressional calls for hearings turned into subpoenas. The House Committee on Homeland Security demanded every internal audit, every complaint log, every training manual related to racial profiling from the past decade. The TSA, cornered, began a frantic internal review. Their lawyers knew that lying to Congress was a felony. The institutional instinct to protect itself now threatened to expose its deepest rot. In a secure conference room, Ambassador Greer sat for her deposition with the Inspector General's office. For 3 hours, she dissected the encounter not as a victim, but as an expert witness on systemic failure. She mapped the officer's actions onto the documented pattern, the invented scanner alert, the focus on her hair, the theatrical dumping of her bag, the confiscation of a compliant item. Each step, she argued, was a choice enabled by vague policy and zero accountability. The IG investigators, usually stoic, took furious notes. One later confessed it was the most devastating testimony they'd ever heard. Then came the counterattack. Officer Jenkins's lawyer, in a leaked letter to the TSA, claimed his client was a scapegoat. He argued that the ambassador's confrontational demeanor and failure to immediately identify herself created the confusion. It was the exact blame shift tactic predicted by the internal memos. But this time, it backfired spectacularly. The ambassador's legal team released a frame-by-frame video analysis with audio enhancement. It proved she had remained silent and compliant until her diplomatic materials were threatened. It also captured Officer Jenkins before any interaction, pointing her out to his colleague and making a comment lost in the noise. A forensic audio expert hired by the ACLU isolated the phrase. He said, "This one's gonna take a minute." The story exploded anew. "This one's gonna take a minute" became a hashtag, a rallying cry. It implied preselection, a presumption of guilt. Other TSA officers anonymously began speaking to journalists. They described unspoken quotas, pressure from supervisors to be more proactive, which in practice meant stopping more people who looked out of place. A former behavior detection officer in Newark confessed the program was a joke. "We were just picking people who made us nervous, and guess what made a lot of guys nervous? Young black men." The pressure reached a breaking point inside the TSA's own Office of Civil Rights and Liberties. The whistleblower, risking everything, agreed to testify before Congress under a promise of anonymity. Their prepared statement began. "For years, we have been documenting a cancer of bias within the agency's frontline operations. And for years, our reports have been watered down, buried, or rewritten to protect the agency's image." They described a culture where complaining about discrimination was seen as being anti-security. Then the "it gets worse" moment. The whistleblower provided internal emails from the Orlando International Airport investigation in 2018. In that case, air marshals had gone public saying their TSA supervisor pressured them to single out minorities with tattoos and baggy clothes. The internal email chain showed the TSA's response wasn't to investigate the supervisor, but to scrutinize the air marshals for insubordination. The problem wasn't the bias, it was the people who exposed it. This revelation connected Ambassador Greer's case to a national tapestry of abuse. It was no longer about one airport, one ambassador. It was about an institutional pathology. News outlets began running investigative series, pairing the ambassador's story with those of a Muslim student detained for having too many books, a Latina grandmother forced to remove her back brace, a black doctor whose medically necessary gel packs were confiscated as suspicious. The TSA's public facade crumbled. Their spokesperson's carefully worded statements now sounded hollow and defensive. Members of Congress from both parties appeared on news shows, demanding the resignation of the TSA administrator and a top-to-bottom overhaul. A bipartisan bill was drafted, clumsily named but powerful, the Traveler Dignity Act. Its first provision, stripping TSA screeners of their immunity from lawsuits for civil rights violations. In a closed-door negotiation, the Department of Homeland Security leadership made a desperate offer to Ambassador Greer's team, a formal public apology, the termination of the two officers, and a substantial monetary settlement for her distress, if she agreed to drop her complaints and cease cooperating with Congress. It was the oldest deal in the book, by silence. Her chief of staff presented the offer. The ambassador listened, then asked a single question. What about the other 3,699 complaints? She rejected the deal. Not only that, she publicly announced her rejection in a written statement. My goal was never compensation or vengeance. It is reform. I will not be silent until the procedures that failed me are changed for every traveler who comes after. Her moral authority became a political battering ram. The following week, the TSA administrator was summoned to testify before a hostile congressional committee. The hearing room was packed, the cameras rolling. The administrator entered with a stack of binders and a prepared statement full of phrases like continuous improvement and commitment to fairness. He never got to finish it. The committee chair, wielding the whistleblower's documents, began the questioning not with the ambassador, but with the data. Administrator, is it true that your own internal analysis found indications of potential discrimination in roughly half of all civil rights complaints reviewed? The administrator stammered, citing privacy concerns. The chair cut him off. Answer the question, yes or no. Does the TSA have a systemic problem with racial profiling? The hearing dissolved into a historic confrontation. Lawmakers presented victim after victim, story after story, each one echoing the ambassador's humiliation. They displayed the For Management eyes-only playbook on giant screens. They played the enhanced audio. This one's gonna take a minute. The administrator, trained for bureaucratic combat, was utterly unprepared for the raw, documented evidence of institutional malice. His legal shield was useless, against the court of public opinion, playing out live on C-SPAN. As the hearing concluded, the committee chair made an announcement. Based on the evidence, they were opening a formal investigation into whether the TSA's leadership had knowingly permitted a pattern of unconstitutional discrimination. This was no longer about a complaint. It was about a potential cover-up at the highest levels. In the wake of the hearing, the dominoes began to fall. The federal security director for the airport where the incident occurred took early retirement. The head of the TSA's Office of Civil Rights and Liberties was reassigned. And then, the biggest domino of all, the TSA administrator announced a top-to-bottom independent review of all screening procedures and complaint processes. It was a surrender, dressed up as proactive reform. Ambassador Greer watched the announcement from her office. There was no triumph in her expression, only weary determination. The battle to expose the truth had been won, but the war to change the system was just beginning. The review would take months. The bureaucratic machinery would fight for every inch. The legal immunity shield still stood, but for the first time, the wall had a massive crack in it. And streaming through that crack was a light the agency had spent years trying to shut out, the unbearable, inconvenient light of public accountability. The question was no longer if the system was broken, but who would have the courage to finally rebuild it. The independent review, when it finally landed, was a 500-page earthquake. Conducted by a panel of former judges and civil rights experts, it validated every major allegation. It confirmed the statistical manipulation of complaint data. It condemned the For Management eyes-only playbook as an unethical shield against accountability. Most damningly, it found a pervasive culture where frontline officers felt implicit pressure to meet informal activity thresholds that incentivized targeting certain travelers. The report's first recommendation was the immediate dissolution of the remaining behavior detection activities. The second was a complete overhaul of the complaint system, with real-time tracking accessible to congressional overseers. The human consequences followed swiftly. Officer Jenkins was terminated, not for a simple mistake, but for conduct unbecoming and deliberate misrepresentation of screening protocols. The official findings stated he had manufactured a pretext for a secondary screening. Officer Briggs, who had shown remorse in her later testimony, was demoted and required to undergo rigorous retraining. The federal security director for the airport accepted early retirement. 3 managers within the Office of Civil Rights and Liberties were reassigned out of the agency. The TSA administrator, his authority irreparably damaged by the congressional hearing, resigned within the month. But the ambassador's fight was for systemic change, not just scalps, and change began to materialize. Within a year, the TSA rolled out a new mandatory training program for all 50,000 screeners. It wasn't just a video. It was an interactive module built around de-escalation and implicit bias, using anonymized real-world cases, including, with her permission, key moments from Ambassador Greer's ordeal. For the first time, officers were being trained not just on what to do, but on the profound impact of how they did it. The Traveler Dignity Act stalled in the Senate, blocked by concerns over liability, but its core mission found life elsewhere. The Department of Homeland Security instituted a new policy. Any traveler filing a civil rights complaint would receive a formal tracking number and a guaranteed response within 60 days. It was a small bureaucratic fix, but it broke the cycle of complaints disappearing into a black hole. The whistleblower from within the TSA, their identity still protected, was awarded a public service commendation by a Civil Liberties Foundation. They had risked everything, and in doing so, had given thousands of others a voice. Ambassador Greer, true to her word, did not fade from the scene. She leveraged her platform to establish a nonprofit coalition called Dignity in Security, bringing together advocacy groups, former security officials, and affected travelers. Their first campaign targeted the Legal Immunity Shield. They funded a strategic lawsuit on behalf of a Muslim family subjected to a prolonged, traumatic detention, aiming to challenge the 2017 appellate ruling. The case was a long shot, but it kept the pressure on, reminding the courts that their sympathy for victims needed a legal remedy. Then came the final, surprising detail. A year after the incident, Ambassador Greer was invited back to the very same airport, not for travel, but to speak at a ceremony for the newly promoted federal security director, a woman who had championed the reforms. After her speech, the ambassador did something unexpected. She walked alone to the same security checkpoint in Terminal B. It was a slow Tuesday morning. The same lanes, the same tables. A new generation of officers, their training fresh, worked the lines. She approached the supervisor's podium. A young officer looked up, ready with the standard greeting. Then recognition dawned. His eyes widened slightly. "Ma'am, Ambassador, is everything all right?" She smiled. "Everything is fine, I just wanted to see it." She didn't go through the checkpoint. She simply stood there for a moment, observing the flow, the beep of scanners, the murmur of passengers, the routine dance of security. The theater of humiliation had been replaced by a quieter, more professional efficiency. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect, but it was different. The poison had been identified, and the antidote, however slow-acting, was being administered. Her story had a ripple effect far beyond the TSA. Airlines retrained their ground staff on interacting with diplomats. The State Department issued new, clearer guidance to ambassadors on their rights during domestic travel. But the most profound impact was cultural. The phrase, "This one's gonna take a minute," entered the lexicon as a shorthand for profiling, a cautionary tale taught in ethics courses for law enforcement and security professionals nationwide. In her final meeting with the House Committee, Ambassador Greer offered her summary. "We asked a simple question: is security served by humiliation? The answer, written in the data and etched in the experiences of thousands, was a resounding no. True security is consistent, predictable, and respectful. It cannot be built on a foundation of bias, because bias makes you blind. It makes you see threats where there are none, and miss the real ones hiding in plain sight. The system had been forced to look at itself in the mirror. The reflection was ugly, but the looking was the first step toward change. The ambassador's suitcase, once emptied onto a metal table, had been repacked with more than clothes. It carried the weight of a national reckoning. And as she walked away from the checkpoint that day, the contents of that suitcase, the evidence, the outrage, the relentless pursuit of accountability, had finally been unpacked where it mattered most. In the halls of power, in the pages of policy, and in the promise that no one should have to surrender their dignity for the illusion of safety. So what does one suitcase, emptied onto a cold table, actually change? It changes the math. Before Ambassador Patricia Greer's ordeal, the statistics on profiling were abstract, buried in government reports. Afterward, they had a face, a voice, and a title that commanded a hearing. The 3,700 complaints were no longer data points. They were a chorus. The system relied on the silence of the humiliated, on the hopelessness of fighting a machine with legal immunity. She broke that silence with the full weight of her office. The real victory wasn't the terminated officer or the resigned administrator. It was the precedent. It proved that the most powerful weapon against systemic bias isn't a lawsuit. It's a spotlight, held steady and without flinching. It's the meticulous documentation, the mastery of policy, the refusal to accept a private settlement that buys your silence. She turned a moment of profound powerlessness into an inexhaustible source of power. But the airport checkpoint remains a friction point between security and liberty, between fear and fairness. The scanners still false alarm on certain hair textures. Officer discretion is still a necessary and dangerous tool. The legal shield, while cracked, remains in place. The work of dignity and security and watchdogs like the ACLU continues precisely because the machinery of any large institution always tends towards self-preservation. Vigilance is the price of progress. The story of Ambassador Greer asks a lingering question of all of us. What do we do with our own moment of witness? Whether it's at an airport, a bank, a traffic stop, or an office, we are all occasional passengers in systems that can dehumanize. Do we look away? Or do we pay attention, record, remember, and when we have the capacity, speak? Her authority came from a diplomatic passport, but the principle is universal. Dignity is not a privilege of status. It is a right of personhood. Her legacy is a reminder that change often arrives not through grand revolutions, but through specific, stubborn confrontations with injustice. One person, one incident, one meticulously built case can become a lever that moves the world. It just requires the courage to be that lever. If you found this story of hidden power and public accountability compelling, make sure to like this video. It helps this channel share more untold stories. And subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. On the screen now, I've selected 2 other special documentaries about ordinary people who faced impossible systems. And one. Thanks for watching.